Rome had seen tyrants, it had endured madmen, it had buried emperors who poisoned brothers, married sisters, and crucified thousands, but it had never seen anything like this. On the Palatine Hill, behind silk-draped columns and walls lined with gold, an emperor prepared not for war, but for a wedding. Not with a sword, but with rouge, not with laurel, but with veil. He stood before polished silver mirrors, brushing perfume onto his neck, lining his eyes with crushed rose petals, adjusting his robes until they clung like silk to his skin. He did not ask to be addressed as Dominus, the master. He instructed his servants to call him Mistress. Outside, the city still called him Caesar. Inside, he whispered something else. Call me Empress. He was not yet 15, and he ruled the most powerful empire the world had ever known. This, by any rational measure, should not be possible. But Rome was no longer rational. The Severan dynasty had turned imperial succession into a bloody lottery, and the gods themselves seemed to have stepped aside, letting chaos rule. In that chaos, a boy had risen, but he was not like other boys. He was not shaped in the Roman tradition, not molded by stoic fathers, not hardened by legionary drills. He was raised in the temples of Syria beneath blazing desert suns and the sacred black stone of the god Elagabalus. He had not been taught to command troops or govern provinces. He had been taught how to worship, how to offer himself to the divine. And somewhere along the way, he came to believe he was divine. To some, his reign would be remembered as a reign of scandal. To others, it would be erased entirely, his name scratched from stone and drowned in the Tiber. But here, we don't rewrite history to make it easier to swallow. We uncover it as it was, raw, strange, brutal, human. Because the truth is stranger than any fiction Rome ever wrote. He married men and called them his husbands. He wore women's clothes not in secret, but in processions. He invited surgeons to his palace and offered them gold if they could make his body match what he believed it was meant to be. And he sold his own body inside the halls of the imperial residence, offering himself not as emperor, but as priestess, mistress, concubine. To Rome, this was madness. To his enemies, it was depravity. To the Senate, it was treason. But to him, it was the truth. He did not see himself as an emperor who played at femininity. He believed he was a woman, born into a boy's body, crowned with a title he never asked for, and trapped in a city that would rather kill him than understand him. His name was Elagabalus. He ruled for less than 4 years. He died in the filth of a Roman latrine, his body torn apart by his own guards. And yet, almost 2,000 years later, we still whisper his name, because Elagabalus is more than a scandal. He is the ghost of a question Rome never answered. Can power tolerate difference? Can empire survive identity? And what happens when the most powerful person in the world no longer fits the world's idea of what power should look like? This is the story of Rome's first trans emperor, and how the world crushed him for trying to become who he was. Before he was called Elagabalus, before Rome came to hate his name, he was simply Varius Avitus Bassianus, a boy born under desert skies, not marble columns. He was not born in the heart of Rome, but in Emesa, a wealthy city in Roman Syria, modern-day Homs. There were temples there older than Jupiter, gods older than Rome itself, and among those gods was one that ruled the lives of his people completely, Elagabalus, the sun. God, embodied by a sacred black meteorite that had fallen from the heavens. This boy was no ordinary child. He was born into the bloodline of emperors, part of the Severan dynasty, a family the Salt. From a young age, Varius was appointed as high priest of Elagabalus. Before he could read Latin law, he was leading chants in Aramaic. Before he could ride a horse, he was swinging censers, his body draped in jewels and silk. He didn't learn the laws of Rome. He learned the rites of sun worship, sacrifice, ecstasy, submission, elevation. He danced before gods. He bowed before fire, and slowly people bowed to him. The line between servant and divinity blurred. He wasn't trained to rule men. He was trained to become more than one. But behind this divine grooming was a far more calculating force. His mother, Julia Soaemius, and especially his grandmother, Julia Maesa, two of the most ambitious women in Roman imperial history. They had witnessed the fall of their kin. Emperor Caracalla, their relative, had been murdered in cold blood. His successor, Macrinus, was a bureaucrat, an outsider with no noble blood, no imperial lineage. Julia Maesa saw an opportunity. If Rome would not willingly place another Severan on the throne, then Rome would be seduced, bribed, and bloodied into accepting it. So she played her final card, the boy priest. She began spreading rumors among the Eastern legions, telling them the sun god himself had declared young Varius to be the rightful emperor. She showed them the sacred black stone of Elagabalus. She promised divine favor, enormous wealth, and the restoration of Severan glory, and the soldiers, restless and superstitious, believed her. In 218 AD, at just 14 years old, the boy priest was proclaimed Emperor of Rome by the Third Gallic Legion. Rome didn't vote for him. The Senate didn't confirm him. This was no peaceful transition. This was a coup wrapped in incense. Macrinus tried to resist. He sent troops to crush the rebellion, but they were defeated. The emperor fled and was hunted down and executed. And just like that, the empire had a new ruler. He didn't speak Latin fluently. He had never commanded an army. He had never governed a province or issued a legal decree. He was a child raised in temples, taught that his body was sacred, and told since birth that he was the vessel of a god. And now, the most powerful title in the known world was laid at his feet: Imperator Caesar, Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus. But he wouldn't use that name. He wouldn't speak like an emperor. He wouldn't act like one either. He would wear makeup, not laurels, silk, not armor. He would bow to no Roman gods. And he would demand the world call him something it had never called an emperor before. He would ask them to call him Mistress. And Rome would soon realize they hadn't crowned a Caesar. They had unleashed something it couldn't understand. Not a boy, not a man, not even a god, but something in between. When Elagabalus entered Rome, the city stared in stunned silence. They had expected a boy emperor, yes, but a Roman boy, a Caesar, a son of Mars. What they received was something altogether different. He arrived in jewels, not armor, perfumed, veiled, dressed in golden silk that shimmered like fire under the Mediterranean sun. He walked like a priestess, not a general. He greeted senators not with the stiffness of imperial formality, but with a gaze that unsettled them, a softness that masked something deeper. From the beginning, he rejected everything Rome expected of an emperor. He didn't just defy masculinity, he abandoned it. He didn't try to pass as Rome's idea of a man. He reshaped the idea entirely. In private, he told his guards to address him with feminine titles. He demanded to be called Domina instead of Dominus, Mistress, not Master. He called himself Empress among his household. He referred to himself as the wife of his male lovers, and not just privately, publicly. He didn't hide his affairs, he embraced them with theatrical pride. He paraded his male lover, the charioteer Heracles, through the palace grounds as if he were royal consort. And to the horror of the court, he openly referred to Heracles as his husband, not in mockery, but in sincerity. To Rome, this wasn't just scandal, it was sacrilege, a reversal of the natural order, a desecration of imperial dignity. The elite whispered behind marble pillars. The Praetorian Guard, stoic, militaristic, stood with their jaws clenched, unsure whether they served an emperor, an empress, or a boy pretending to be both. But the confusion wasn't just theirs, it was Rome's. Because Elagabalus didn't perform femininity as disguise or decadence, he lived it. He treated his identity not as a costume, but as truth. When he wore makeup, it wasn't theatre, it was ritual. When he slipped into silks, it wasn't for pleasure, it was recognition. He wasn't mocking women, he was becoming one, in the only ways the ancient world allowed. Even his sexual relationships weren't hidden. He didn't just sleep with men in secret, he announced his intentions. He is said to have chosen lovers based not only on their beauty, but on their willingness to dominate him. Elagabalus once declared that Heracles beat him like no one else ever had, and that he adored him for it. This wasn't indulgence, it was transformation. He blurred not just gender, but power, status, control. He turned the palace into a mirror where every role could be reversed. And all the while, his grandmother Julia Maesa watched silently. She had engineered his rise, funded his rebellion, and bribed the legions that placed the crown on his head. Now she found herself watching her creation spiral into something unpredictable. Was she proud, ashamed, terrified? We'll never know. But she said nothing. She kept him on the throne, even as the empire muttered, even as the Senate fumed. Maybe she thought she could rein him in, maybe she believed the boy priest still had a god's favor, or maybe she was waiting to see how far Rome's patience could stretch, because every day Elagabalus tested it, every lover flaunted, every ritual performed, every title claimed, and every moment he stood on the imperial balcony dressed not as Caesar, but as Empress, was a challenge. A question thrown in the face of Roman tradition. Who decides what an emperor must be? Rome had no answer, only fear. And that fear was growing. By the third year of his reign, Elagabalus had stripped away any illusion that he was simply eccentric. He wasn't playing dress-up. He wasn't performing scandal. He was becoming. No longer content to simply wear the garments of a woman, he pursued something far more radical. He wanted to physically transform. In a world that had no language for gender dysphoria, no science to support it, Elagabalus asked the impossible. He offered vast sums of gold to any physician who could surgically remove his male anatomy. He wanted to become, literally, a woman. Ancient historians record this with disdain and mockery, but hidden within their cruelty is something extraordinary, the earliest recorded account of a ruler seeking gender-affirming surgery. He asked his court doctors if it could be done. If nature had made a mistake, could man correct it? Could the divine will be made flesh? The idea horrified Rome. Even his enemies didn't know how to explain it. To them, it was proof of madness. But to Elagabalus, it was destiny. He believed that the body he had been given, muscular, male, imperial, was a prison. He believed his true self had been caged behind flesh. And now, as emperor with the wealth of the world at his command, he was going to try to escape it. He offered prizes, titles, estates, all to the man who could turn his body into what he felt it should have been. There is no record that any surgery was ever completed, but the desire itself is telling. Elagabalus wasn't satisfied with embolism. He sought transformation, real, bloody, dangerous, and it didn't end there. According to the Historia Augusta, he had a chamber built in the imperial palace, a room where he would wait behind a curtain under an alias, offering himself to passers-by as a prostitute. He wanted to be desired, not as emperor, not as a man in drag, but as a woman. This was not humiliation, it was confirmation, it was validation. Every transaction, every whispered name, every act in the shadows was Elagabalus trying to prove to the world and to himself that he could be seen for who he was. He would even have his guards announce that a beautiful woman was available to be taken, luring strangers into hidden rooms in the palace. And there, in the gilded shadows of empire, Elagabalus would play the role he believed was his truth. Mistress, bride, goddess. The sources are brutal. Roman historians sneer at him. They call him debauched, insane, a disgrace to the empire. But the words they use, effeminate, passive, shameless, reveal more about Rome than they do about him. In a world built on dominance, patriarchy, and rigid order, Elagabalus's very existence was rebellion. Not because he sought pleasure, but because he sought freedom. Freedom to break the rules written by men in togas. Freedom to reshape the most sacred identity in the Roman world, the emperor. And in doing so, he shattered the most sacred assumption of all, that power must always look like a man. But Rome was not ready for that kind of freedom. The empire could tolerate cruelty. It had survived lunatics and tyrants. But it could not survive a ruler who redefined the body itself, who said, "I am not what you expect, and I never will be." For a society built on control, hierarchy, and appearance, Elagabalus was the ultimate threat. And every act of self-declaration, every veil, every kiss, every whispered name behind palace curtains brought him one step closer to the edge of the knife. Elagabalus didn't just challenge Rome's idea of gender. He assaulted its very soul, its gods, its rituals, its sacred foundations. Because to understand him, you have to understand what Rome feared most: disorder. The emperor was more than a ruler. He was the embodiment of Roman virtues, manliness, stability, control, and religion was its spine. Jupiter, Mars, Vesta, these gods weren't abstract. They were guardians of the Roman identity. Elagabalus shattered that identity like a wine goblet dropped from a golden throne. He brought his foreign god with him from Syria, Elagabal, the sun deity, a god older than Rome, wilder, unpredictable. Not a statue, but a black meteorite, believed to have fallen from the heavens, shaped by fire, and he didn't place it quietly in a temple. He elevated it, physically and symbolically, above Jupiter, the king of Roman gods. He had a temple built on the Palatine Hill, the sacred heart of the empire. He named it the Elagabalium. He declared that this eastern god would now rule over Rome. He forced the Senate and priests to attend sacrifices to this foreign power, whether they liked it or not. To traditional Romans, this wasn't religion, it was blasphemy. But Elagabalus saw it differently. He believed he was the living priest of the sun, that he, too, was divine. He didn't distinguish between his body and his god. The way he presented himself, his makeup, his silk robes, his offerings of flesh, these weren't personal indulgences. They were sacred acts. He believed that gender, like power, was fluid, and divinity, like his own body, was meant to be adorned, worshipped, and desired. His rituals reflected this. Every festival became a ceremony of spectacle. Animals slaughtered in the name of the sun god. Priests dressed in rich purple, performing dances that resembled seduction more than sacrifice. And Elagabalus, standing at the center of it all, dressed in flowing robe. His face painted like a goddess of fertility, his voice chanting hymns the Romans could not understand. He didn't just mix religion with pleasure, he replaced the sacred with the sensual. And it wasn't just the gods he married, it was people. At one point he arranged a wedding ceremony between Elagabal, the meteorite, and a Roman goddess. Statues were joined in matrimony. Offerings were made, senators were forced to attend. It wasn't a joke, it wasn't satire. To Elagabalus, this was holy union, divine consummation. But to the Roman elite, it was insanity wrapped in heresy. Then came his most outrageous act. He married a Vestal virgin. Vestal virgins were Rome's holiest women, sworn to 30 years of celibacy, considered sacred protectors of the city. Breaking their vow was treason. Touching one was sacrilege. Elagabalus didn't care. He married her in a public ceremony and claimed their union would birth a divine child, a child of sun and fire, a new god to rule over Rome. That child never came. But the damage was done. The religious order of Rome, its rituals, its oaths, its sanctity, had been desecrated by its own ruler, and behind palace doors, things grew even more disturbing. He surrounded himself with eunuchs, dancers, musicians from the east. He threw feasts where guests would be served food dyed to look rotten, or real dishes filled with live animals, leaping from trays to screams and laughter. He had dinner tables designed with hidden mechanisms that would collapse under guests he disliked, sending them crashing to the floor. And then there were the orgies. Stories tell of rooms lined with cushions and silk, where Elagabalus would host erotic performances that blended ritual with depravity. He would assign roles, men as women, women as warriors, slaves as kings. Power dynamics were reversed, blurred, shattered. Sex became sacrament, domination became theatre. And Elagabalus reigned over it all, not as emperor, but as goddess. To him these acts were more than pleasure, they were statements, that Rome's structures were false, that power, like the gods, belonged to those who could reshape it, that the emperor could be anything, man, woman, priest, bride. But to the empire these weren't ideas, they were threats. The Praetorian Guard began to murmur. The Senate stewed in silence. Even his grandmother, Julia Maesa, watched as the boy she had placed on the throne turned into a being she could no longer control, and somewhere in the shadows of the palace, the knives were beginning to sharpen. Not through invasion, not through famine or fire, but through something far more dangerous to Rome. Humiliation. Elagabalus had not just broken the rules of gender, religion, and power, he had mocked them. And worse, he had made Rome a laughingstock in the eyes of its own people. The provinces began to whisper. Legions stationed abroad muttered discontent, and in the Senate, the ancient heart of Roman tradition, resentment boiled like blood in a sealed vessel. Rome had endured monsters before, Caligula, Nero, Commodus. But those men at least played the part of Caesar when needed. Elagabalus didn't even pretend. He wasn't just strange. He was unpredictable, unstable, and worst of all, uncontrollable. The Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers tasked with protecting the emperor, began to fracture. They had once been loyal, paid handsomely, flattered with titles. But Elagabalus's disregard for Roman norms, his open sexuality, his nightly orgies, and his Eastern religion had made them uneasy. Some called him a disgrace to the uniform, others called him a blasphemy in the flesh. He was said to have mocked the guard behind their backs, offering promotions not based on merit or valor, but on appearance, submission, or personal desire. And slowly, the unspoken truth began to take shape in dark corridors and whispered corners. He had to go. But how do you remove an emperor without starting a civil war? That's where Julia Maesa returned. She had been in quiet in recent years, watching. This was, after all, the grandson she had made emperor, the boy she had crowned with bribes and blood. She had given him Rome, and now she realized she would have to take it away. She began grooming a replacement, Severus Alexander, Elagabalus's cousin. just a child, but obedient, Roman, untainted. She presented him as the opposite of Elagabalus in every way, dignified, traditional, masculine, silent. He became the anti-Elagabalus. The Praetorian Guard began to shift their loyalty. Quietly at first, then openly. Some refused to guard the palace, others leaked information to Julia Maesa. The emperor felt it. He sensed the walls tightening, the eyes watching. His behavior grew more erratic, more paranoid. He dismissed allies, executed servants, accused the guard of conspiracy, but he was too late. In early 222 AD, Elagabalus made a fatal mistake. He demanded the Senate officially elevate Severus Alexander to the rank of co-emperor, but only as a gesture of unity. The guards saw their opportunity. They agreed, then made their move. One morning, they stormed the imperial palace, not as protectors, but as executioners. They found Elagabalus hiding with his mother, Julia Soaemias, terrified, betrayed, cornered. He begged, he wept, he clung to her, screaming that the gods would punish them, but no divine lightning came, no sacred fire, no sun god, just steel. They dragged the emperor from the palace, kicking and clawing. His mother was slaughtered first, stabbed and thrown to the crowd like meat. Then Elagabalus, once priest, once goddess, once emperor, was cut down in the filth of a Roman latrine. His body was mutilated, dragged through the streets, stripped naked, spat on by the same city that once called him divine. And then, as if to erase the very memory of him, they threw his corpse into the Tiber River, Rome's ancient artery, where so many disgraced souls had vanished before him. The Senate passed a motion of damnatio memoriae. His name was struck from monuments. His statues were defaced. His coins were melted. His portraits destroyed. He was not just killed, he was erased, not because he lost a battle, not because he failed the empire, but because he was unacceptable. His body, his rituals, his truth, all had threatened the Roman illusion of order, and the empire would rather drown him in silence than admit what he had revealed, that its power was not eternal, that its gods were not invincible, and that identity, even in a palace of marble, could not be chained forever. They called him a monster, a pervert, a disgrace, a blasphemer. But what terrified Rome most was that he might have been something else entirely, something it couldn't define, something it couldn't destroy fast enough, something that spoke to a truth far older and far more dangerous than any temple Rome had ever built. They threw his body into the Tiber as if to cleanse the empire of its shame, but no river can wash away a story, and Elagabalus's story, his life, his reign, his transformation, refused to disappear. He ruled for just 4 years. He died at 18. And yet, his legacy haunts the historical record like a ghost that refuses to be forgotten. For centuries, he was reduced to footnotes, mocked in scrolls, laughed at in textbooks, dismissed as a cautionary tale. What happens when an emperor indulges too much? But beneath the slander, something deeper remains. Elagabalus did what no emperor before him dared to do. He rejected the most sacred assumptions of power. He looked at the rigid world of Roman masculinity, with its polished armor, its dead-eyed senators, its gods carved in stone, and said, no. He declared himself a woman. He married men. He worshipped a foreign god, in foreign robes, with foreign rites. He turned his body into a battleground of identity and forced the most powerful civilization on earth to look at it. And for that, he was destroyed. Not just killed, obliterated. Damnatio memoriae wasn't just a punishment, it was an act of political surgery, a ritual erasure, a way of making sure that no one could even remember what had existed. But memory is stubborn. Fragments survive. A coin with his profile, a passage from Cassius Dio, sneering but detailed, a few lines in the Historia Augusta full of poison, yet unable to look away, and over time those fragments began to pulse, to flicker, to speak. Because Elagabalus is more than a figure of ridicule, he is a question, a mirror, a challenge. Was he Rome's most decadent emperor, or its most honest? Was he insane, or simply ahead of his time? Was he an abomination, or a child, thrust into power, raised in sacred theatre, trying desperately to become something the world had no name for? Maybe he was all of those things, maybe none. But what's certain is this: he was the first ruler in recorded history to openly reject the gender assigned to him, to seek transformation. to pursue identity not in secret shame but in public power. And that truth, buried under centuries of mockery and violence, now rises again, not in the ruins of palaces, but in the questions we still ask today. What do we do with those who don't fit, who refuse the roles we assign them, who dare to reshape themselves, not quietly, but boldly, with the whole world watching? Rome answered those questions with blood, but history does not always obey its conquerors. Elagabalus is still here, not as an emperor, not as a god, but as a symbol of defiance, of fluidity, of a soul that tried to live out loud in an age that demanded silence. His enemies wanted him forgotten, but in telling his story, we defy them. Because this isn't just the tale of a fallen emperor. It's the story of someone who wanted to be seen, not as a man, not as a woman, not as a ruler, but as himself, or perhaps herself. And that truth, uncomfortable and untamable, is the very thing that makes Elagabalus unforgettable.